Okay, welcome everybody. Today we're covering the Denver Green Code Committee hearing. If you're thinking you're in a different committee hearing, that's fine. You're welcome to stay, but this is for the Denver Green Code hearing. So a little housekeeping rules that we'll go through before we get started. One item I want to talk about is that we would like all the committee members to have their cameras on throughout the presentation or throughout the hearing. This is to simulate as if we're in a room all together and able to see each other's faces and talk to each other. Unfortunately, with the current COVID situations, we do have to do this virtually, so we want to make it as similar to being in person as possible. We also ask that you mute yourself unless you are currently speaking. Again, we just want to ask that you respect everybody as if you're in a meeting with them together. So we know that sometimes you have to run to the restroom or turn your camera off or do something. Please turn your camera off if you have to attend to something. And then when you're done attending to that, please turn your camera back on and rejoin the session. Another item is that we have disabled, at least I'm trying to, disable the chat function. We will be disabling that for the general public. However, the committee members are allowed to chat in the chat box. However, we ask that you do not do that and have sidebar conversations. You would not do that if you're in a room with each other. So please respect that. If you lose audio and you can't get a hold of us or something like that, please go ahead and use the chat function for that capability. I will say that it is a long session. We have about 3 hours worth. So hopefully you got your snacks and a good drink by your side. But we will take a break about halfway through, 5 or 10 minute break. It won't be exactly halfway through. Whenever we get close to halfway through or a little over, we will take that break so you can attend to your phone calls or texts or emails, maybe run to the restroom. One other thing I will talk about for the public that we mentioned, we will be following Robert Rules of Order. And that is basically, if you don't know what those are, high level, the proposal will be introduced by the proponent. They will speak, give a summary about the proposal that they're bringing forward to you all. From there, we will ask the general public if they want to speak in support of that. They will have 2 minutes to do so. There'll be a little timer on the screen counting down for them. And then once everybody's been able to speak in support, we'll ask general public, anybody wants to speak in opposition. They again will have 2 minutes to do that. From there, it goes to the committee, you all, who will then have time to discuss, ask questions, things of that nature. From there, we can, if there's any rebuttal from the community, we would go back to them. They would have 1 minute to rebuttal, and then it comes back to you all, the committee member, for a modification, if you want to modify it, if you want to call for vote, things like that. So then we'll call for voting, and then we will vote as a committee on that. So to practice that real quick, everybody on the committee or attendees too, feel free, because this is how you're going to be able to speak. Committee members, this is how you're going to be able to speak and vote. Go ahead and try and raise your hand and make sure that you all can do that. Good, I see some people from the public doing it. I see the panelists doing it. I still see some committee members still needing to do that. Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and lower all your hands. Okay, so with that, I want to turn it over to Eric. He has some housekeeping things or items that he wanted to cover. So Eric, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. Appreciate it. For those that don't know me, my name is Eric Browning. I'm the Chief Building Official for Community Planning and Development here at the City and County of Denver. Just one of the members here on the committee. In terms of a couple of items we wanted to talk through before we got started into the formal proposal considerations. We want to recognize that there are a fairly large number of proposals that we would like to try to work our way through. We have 6 hearings to do so. You know, this is a room full of subject matter experts, and there can often be a lot of very good conversation around these proposals, which we absolutely encourage. Questions, conversation, you know, respectful debate. That's why we're here. That being said, we found that there may be some opportunity for the committee as a whole, perhaps to come to a point of agreement that a proposal in and of itself is ready for approval. And there might be just 1 or 2, what I would describe as perhaps minor items, maybe just a small bit of text, or maybe a numerical value, a percentage on something, or a range of something that needs to be worked out. But quite frankly, it really isn't worth another 20 or 30 minutes of full committee time to do that. And so what we'll be trying to identify, and granted this is a bit subjective, but you know, we'll be keeping an eye out for those sorts of things. And if it gets to the point where we're down to just one of those very minor items, or a couple very minor items on a particular proposal, we might call for a vote of the committee and ask the committee to go ahead and you know, approve that, with the understanding that a subset or a small ad hoc group of interested committee members could get together outside of the committee, go ahead and resolve those very minor issues, and then that's what would move forward to the final proposed amendment documents. It would not come back to the committee, because the committee would already be voting on it and agreeing that whoever the small subset or ad hoc group
I think Eric
educated enough,
there for a minute.
reasonableness, you know, that sort of thing. So let's see, am I back at this point? Yeah, sorry, I saw the pop up. At what point did you lose me there?
We were hearing about the having an ad hoc group as a subcommittee potentially.
Okay, right. So yeah, and so that group would iron out just those little minor details, and then that's what would go on to City Council for approval. It would not come back to the full committee for another vote. So the committee would be trusting in that small group to iron out those little minor things, and perhaps that can save us in aggregate some significant amount of time. So if we get to one of those, you know, we'll identify what we're doing, and quite frankly, if the committee is uncomfortable with that for any particular proposal, we don't have to go down that road. We can continue the discussion. But we do want to just be aware of the quantity of proposals we're trying to work our way through, and the, you know, limited amount of time, even though it's 3 hours. Altogether, we have about 18 hours, but we have a lot of proposals and a lot of you know, complicated content to work on. So that was just one item. The other item that I wanted to mention is that the City of Denver staff is going to spend a little bit of time looking at all of the different proposals that are intended to be heard by the committee. And we have an intention of maybe trying to identify a handful, whether that's 2 or 3 or 5, that might be actually very minor proposals, very easy to understand, and theoretically easily approvable. And if we can identify a small subset, what we're going to do is pull those out. We'll inform the full committee of what those are, and we may request a block vote on that subset of very, you know, minor basic proposals. And again, that's just kind of an efficiency option there, where you know, if we can end up with half a dozen that, you know, we all can agree on during our own review and outside time, that okay, yeah, these are easy, these are great. We can come back to committee on a later hearing. We can propose them as a block vote, and we can move forward. If there are any within that block that folks are you know, uncomfortable with or would prefer a more robust discussion, we could pull it out of the block and it would just be heard as an individual proposal. So we'll be looking to do that as part of this committee. And quite honestly, even if there's only 2 or 3, there's still a little bit of savings. Hopefully more than I've just spent telling you about those ideas just now. So with that being said, are there any questions about those two different items that I've just mentioned from anyone on the committee? If there are, jump in or raise your hand. I don't see either. Okay, so let me go ahead and turn it over to Kristy Collins for a minute. And she's going to speak more high level about the committee and a couple of questions that came up since the orientation. And we just want to make sure that there's clarity because we think if some people had questions about things after the orientation, others may as well. So I'll turn it over to you, Kristy.
Yep. So I will run through this really quickly, should only take a few minutes. So a few things just to make sure we're all on the same page. Our intention is right now is not to make the Denver Green Code in whole mandatory as a mandatory regulation, but to use it in conjunction with other mandatory regulations. So we're going to integrate it with our mandatory regulations in a couple of ways. In 2022, we're going to make limited use of the Denver Green Code mandatory for all commercial projects, with residential to follow in the future, hopefully not far future. This will inspire readership because this limited mandatory use will include selecting a couple of provisions from each chapter. As the Denver Green Code gets updated, more provisions will be moved to mandatory regs that already exist, that the development community uses already. So as everybody gains familiarity with things that are in the Denver Green Code and gets comfortable with them, then we can move them into the mandatory regulations without it being challenging and problematic for everybody. That allows us to then make room so that those priorities have been advanced and we can bring in new priorities, which can then be read and familiarized with and move on as well. So as we add those new provisions, we'll continue this cycle of readership and familiarity and consideration, and then the shift to mandatory. The goal is to use the Denver Green Code as a bridge between city plans, which respond to community visions, and city regulations. So currently, right now, when a mandatory provision is proposed and the development community doesn't accept it, it doesn't have any place to go. We would like the Denver Green Code to be the place where it can go. It becomes the middle ground so that everybody can continue to consider it and understand it and figure out how to succeed with it and get comfortable with it so that it can then be brought to mandatory in the future. The goal is also to use the Denver Green Code to learn which proposed provisions are absolutely undoable, even after they've hung out in the Denver Green Code and people have had, development teams have had a chance to think about how to achieve what's being targeted. And then we can discuss why those are unachievable, what support might be beneficial to make those provisions reachable. There are some potential opportunities within the city to provide support if and when that's appropriate, applicable, helpful. And so we just need that dialogue so that we can move things forward together. We also will be looking at which provisions get selected through this limited mandatory use on commercial projects, and that's going to help us understand which ones are more doable and which ones are less. And then key lessons learned from the 2019 Denver Green Code was an area of curiosity. I think we've got 4 that we would list. 1, if a regulation is solely voluntary, even if it's incentivized, the majority of project teams won't ever even look at it. So to get everybody to look at it, some aspect has to be mandatory. That gets us meaningful interest and engagement and readership. Incentives offered in 2019, expedited permitting and 50% off permit fees up to $50,000 were welcome, but they were not adequate to inspire widespread competition for pilot slots. So we learned from that. The 5 commercial pilot spots did ultimately all get taken, but the teams who took them were mostly internally self-motivated teams who differentiate themselves by pursuing higher performance projects. In other words, the incentives were not enough to inspire project teams who were on track to do a conventional project to change over and do a higher performance project. And then the last thing, although the 2019 Denver Green Code as written compliance path is less stringent and results in lower requirements in the project performance, it actually was the least desired option amongst the 4. The other 3 being LEED Platinum, zero net energy in an all electric building, or passive house plus all non-energy Denver Green Code chapters as written. We believe that the reason why it was less desirable was simply a lack of familiarity, which tells us that getting teams to read the code is one of the hurdles beyond simply supporting teams and figuring out how to comply with it. So those were our big key lessons, and that's what we're responding to in 2022 as we move forward. And that was what I had.
Great, thanks, Kristy and Eric. Are there any questions before we move forward on that? I think that was, both of those conversations were very insightful. Go ahead and raise your hand if you have any questions. Okay, seeing none, we'll get started. So I'm going to share my screen again, make sure I'm sharing the right one. Okay, we do have a question. Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to clarify that point. Kristy, I think that is a fundamental change in my understanding of what the Green Code does, maybe for others too. So just to restate what you just said, are you saying that we are going to select menu items, or that some of which may become mandatory for all commercial projects?
So the plan is not for us to select those items for the project teams. We actually are thinking if each chapter has some amount of provisions, so say there are 12 provisions in one of the chapters, we're going to ask each team to select 2 from, and I'm throwing out 2, it'll be a small number of provisions from each chapter, which means each team will have to read all of the provisions to decide which ones fit their project. That gets us the readership and familiarity with the priorities that we're representing here in the Denver Green Code without negatively impacting the cost of projects, because I'm quite confident that teams will be able to find a tiny number of provisions from each chapter to comply with that don't add cost and trauma to their project. The goal with the Denver Green Code limited mandatory use is not to raise the bar substantially on the performance of every commercial project in Denver. It's to get every commercial project team reading the Denver Green Code so that we can move those provisions to mandatory regulations more quickly. Because some of this stuff is just familiarity and people thinking about it and thinking differently. You know, projects happen on really quick timeframes, and there's a sort of rhythm to it that teams have where things get repeated. We've got to shift some of those practices, and everybody just needs to figure out how to succeed in a different way.
Okay, so just again to restate, so we're going to qualify a list of items that all commercial projects certifying under the mandatory code update will select a subset of as part of their project.
We're not, I don't think we're going to qualify any of the provisions. We're going to say at the end of this process, the city team is just going to look and determine, and we'll probably have a conversation with the committee about it, but we're going to look at each of one of the chapters and just say it's reasonable to expect that 2 can be chosen from this chapter, 3 can be chosen from this chapter, none can be chosen from this chapter, and put that out there as the requirement. So it won't be you choose from a limited subset. It will be read the whole code, because you're going to choose from, you know, you're going to have all of these to choose from in some capacity.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, Jonathan, it looks like you also have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was just one sort of follow-up clarification on that, I guess. So is the intention that this whole process would extend out past 2030, or is it the idea that the Denver Green Code, it would be sort of done by 2030, and whatever we had decided to integrate into the building code would be done then, and then there wouldn't be this optional piece?
The vision is that this will likely be expected to extend beyond 2030, because conditions in Denver are going to keep changing. Denver as a city is going to keep changing, and the needs of our community are going to keep changing as those conditions change. So we don't expect that we're going to meet a bunch of goals in 2030 and call it. We expect that we'll be on our road trying to get to Comp Plan 2040 vision or any updated visions, because in 8 years that vision may be updated. And that everything that's happening through both the conscious interventions of what we're doing as development teams and also the unconscious results that are happening will dictate new needs that we need to meet to keep the community moving in a positive direction. So we kind of think that to keep the community moving in a way that our development contributes towards a positive evolution of our ecosystem here so that we can actually continue to stay here longer term, we're going to have to keep updating this and helping to guide how development accomplishes that.
Okay, thank you. That looks like all the questions, so we'll move forward. I will say one thing. We have a couple people on the line on the committee side that you may or may not be familiar with during your orientation. That's Kara and Kristen. Today, they're going to be acting as the subject matter experts and the note takers, just as a heads up. So the first proposal that we'll hear today, Kara is going to present that as the proponent, and Kristen will be the note taker. However, after the first proposal, they will flop roles, just so you know, and Kara will be the note taker, and Kara will take notes, and Kristen will be the subject matter expert. So just so you know, that's how it is. So let's get started. The first one, Kara, I'll put it up on the screen if you want to go ahead and give us a summary of this proposal.
Great. So this first proposal is around creating an ecological impact plan for each project. And this is proposed to be a new section, section 103 in chapter 1 in the administrative chapter, and is primarily intended, piggybacking off of what Kristy said, to promote thinking on a systems level and to require an assessment that fully evaluates the impact of a project on the ecology, the culture, and the neighborhood scale of the project. So an assessment would be required in the concept submittal and would cover the topics of topography, hydrology, climate, vegetation and animal habitat, soils, human use, and human health effects. And we can dig into any of those topics a little bit further too. And we mimicked this framework on a sustainable sites initiative and a lead credit for site assessment. So perhaps this framework will not be unfamiliar to projects, making it maybe not quite as onerous as it might sound on the surface. And I don't know if anyone has questions. Sorry, this is the first one in my first hearing, so I'm just going for it.
Sure, no worries. That's great. I appreciate that. That's a great summary. What we do from here is that we actually turn it over to the general public for any comments in support of, and then opposition, then the committee can talk on that. So we will turn it over. Committee members, please hold tight. We will turn it over to the general public. Anybody that wants to speak in support of this proposal, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support of this proposal, please raise your hand. And anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support, please raise your hand. Okay, seeing none, we'll go to opposition. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of this, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. And final call, anybody from the general public wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Okay, seeing none, now I turn it back over to you, committee. You are allowed to go ahead and raise your hand if you want to speak. You can ask Kara questions about it. You can have conversations amongst each other. You can state some comments. Anything you want to speak, go ahead and do so. So I will call you in the order that you raise your hand. Jason, you're up first.
Thanks. I just want to make sure this is just an informational statement. It's not something that has to be approved or signed off on.
That is correct. It does not have a stringency tied to it. It is a document submittal without.
But I would add that the content of the document will have to be of significant level. So if it's falling short in providing proof of good research and a good understanding of what's being stated, we will give comments back until we receive that. So, you know, I mean, the point would be we don't want fluff. We want teams to actually understand how their project is going to affect the sort of small local ecosystem and then Denver as a whole.
Gotcha, thank you.
Okay, next up would be Eric.
Great, thank you. I just want to ask for some feedback on the mandatory nature of the language here, just so that the committee is clear on what mandatory means.
My understanding is that this would apply to all building projects unless the scope is occurring inside the building envelope and would not affect the building site at all. And this would be mandatory for any project going through the Denver Green Code process. Kristy, I don't know if you have an understanding, if you think this might be something you might also want to apply more broadly.
Yeah, so I'll talk actually to mandatory and elective because there's a little bit of fluidity still in what we're looking at relative to that. What's being suggested by calling it mandatory versus elective would not be a consideration for all commercial projects who will have to select a couple of provisions from each chapter. So those designations simply identify it as a singular provision, and then the mandatory elective applies for Denver Green Code pilot projects. Denver Green Code pilot projects that pursue the Denver Green Code as written path will need to comply with a certain set of mandatory provisions that they have to pursue, and then choose from other provisions that are labeled as elective, some certain number that we will define when we're at the end of this committee process. And then that in aggregate, kind of like how the LEED system works, the prerequisites, and then you choose some, that would then comprise a compliant project. So as we talk about these provisions, we have put preliminary labels pertaining to mandatory or elective, but when we are done going through the committee process, the city team is going to revisit those labels and recalibrate that with an intent of making the Denver Green Code as written path commensurate with LEED Platinum as far as level of benefit goes. There's a bit of subjectivity to that judgment, but that is what we're going to do. And then we will finalize which are mandatory under the pilot program path versus electives that get selected from. We have also talked about the potential of making this ecological impact statement mandatory for all commercial projects, but we are getting away from that. So I'm just going to separate that off. Don't worry about that because I don't think that that's where we think it makes sense to go for a variety of reasons. But that mandatory really just pertains to the pilot program designations and not to what would pertain to that limited to mandatory use for all commercial projects.
Okay, next up, we will go to Travis.
Hey, well, I think my first question got answered because it was going to be about the mandatory and if it applied to all buildings in Denver. I think I have more just like comments kind of mixed with a lot of questions on this one. You know, this is a statement I'm assuming is going to be coming out of an architect's office. And we're saying that that would be done during the pre-design stage and it would be reviewed by the city. And how would that be handled? I mean, how is this envisioned being reviewed? What's the timeline like that? What are we doing on a project? I think that's probably my first question is, and it sounded like it's not getting a formal, but we'll just be told if it's not satisfactory enough and to adjust it. And how is that going to be accommodated by the city?
So the intention is that this be submitted at the concept stage, which would be well before CDs are developed. We would work with the team. We would provide guidance on what's not, adequately researched or represented. And as the team enters into the SDP phases, during those early SDP phases, I would imagine that the overlap of the timing of updating this statement can coexist with that early SDP process. The intent of having this submitted with the concept submittal is to make sure that these considerations are being taken taken into account early in the process because they will impact the basic structure of the project. And if this isn't considered early on, then it loses a lot of its potential. So there isn't one single, like, you must finish getting through all review cycles and approval on this before you can submit your third SDP or whatever it may be. But the sooner the team gets through this, the simpler it will be for the team to integrate the comments that are being provided, because the comments will pertain to a document that's really impactful from that concept early stage.
And then I think that makes some sense. I personally am concerned about the timing. Just, it already takes forever to get anything through the city right now. So adding more stuff for really kind of like adding a research paper onto a project, I don't personally feel like that adds a whole lot. I think there's some areas in verbiage here that I'm just unsure on. I think, first of all, I don't understand why there's not a project threshold built into this, because if a homeowner is trying to do a small 100-foot addition onto their house and it's going underneath remodel and addition, understanding that we're not making residential mandatory yet, with the idea that we may, and this may be in there. I don't see why they're going to hire somebody to do a research paper that covers all of this. Topography and hydrology sections are pretty much covered through geotechnical reports. The climate area, all those line items except for line item B, heat island effect potential, that's all generally covered through an architect's license and what we're required through testing. So solar exposure, prevailing winds, that's all research that we're responsible to do already. So I guess, yeah, we can write it down, but it feels like that's already a liability that's already built in. The vegetation and animal habitat section, we would need consultants on. That's just pretty lengthy section. So again, I think without having sufficient project threshold established into this for what it becomes mandatory, I think that's a problem as far as how I see this impacting small projects, adaptive reuse projects, and so forth. There's a line in the 103.1.1, a sentence that says, the assessment shall also identify ways in which Denver is functioning successfully as a system, supporting resident life as well as wildlife, and opportunities to improve parts of the system currently in decline. So again, this is just a scope issue to me. When I think about the large renovation of Elich Gardens and how that land use is going to completely change, and there's proposals for mixed occupancy structures, residential, office, park space, that makes total sense for this type of mandatory use. But I don't see how that applies to the smaller level of projects and how that actually provides much value. It feels like we're just going to be adding paperwork. And so I think that comes down to a cost and benefit situation for me there.
Can I respond to some of what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to take a step back because I'm not sure that we maybe explained this about the Denver Green Code thoroughly. The intention is not that every provision in the Denver Green Code applies to every project that exists out in the community. So if a provision doesn't apply to a project, then that team doesn't need to choose it. So I just want to be careful, like a 100 square foot renovation on a home or addition on a home, if this does become relevant for residential projects, it's fine that team doesn't choose this. And we are looking at it through the eye of different project types to make sure that we don't require project types that, only a small percentage of the provisions apply to choose the same number of provisions as project types for which a large percentage apply to. So that's not a limiting factor. I think the bigger thing is to put this on the radar as a priority that the community carries. The community wants to help the ecosystem. And so if a team can't pursue this, then that is okay. If it's not relevant, a good fit for the project, then they choose something else. I think the other thing to say is agreed that consultants and research will be required for parts and pieces of this. And that's okay with us because the intent is that project teams will choose from the different choices in the Denver Green Code, the provisions that resonate with their team's values and their team's intentions and goals for their project. So the team that chooses this will be okay that there's some research, because that's something that they value and they care how they're affecting the ecosystem and how they're affecting the vegetation and the animal life that's on the site. So so those are things that we did discuss, but we were okay with.
And that's where I think my minor confusion here is because it's in chapter 1. It wasn't clear to me if, you know, and then we're saying it's like it applies to everything. Right now it's only commercial. I think to me it's still, I think that there just needs to be some sort of project threshold in here for this. But if we're saying we pick a la carte on green code even out of chapter 1, you know, people are going to have to find ways to tally up points in a different way, I guess.
Sure,
I think
Travis,
those
I'm
are
going
my
to
big
interject. Travis, I'm going to interject for the sake of time. This is all great discussion, but it seems like we're kind of going in a circle here. So if this goes for all committee members, if there's something you don't agree with, that's fine, and you want to add something, if, like, for instance, if you want a project threshold, go ahead and suggest that to the committee. And it doesn't have to be the correct threshold, right? That can be hammered out later. But I think we've gotten your concerns across here. So if you don't have anything new to add, I'm going to move on to the next person, if that's all right.
Yeah, you're good. If we want to just add threshold, I think if we type that to the green roof of 25,000 square feet of commercial as a threshold.
Okay. So when we get to a time for a motion, you can make that motion, or someone else can make that motion to modify as well. So thank you. We'll move on to Daniel. You're next.
There we go. You guys hear me? You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So you, Kristy, we're just talking about who this might be mandatory for. So is that something that's going to come later? Because it's saying mandatory, which would mean if you're doing the as written, I forget what we call it, path of DGC, you would use it, but you were saying that we haven't seen projects choose that path. So it might make sense to make it mandatory for all projects, even if you're using a lead or a zero net or something. So when does that come into the conversation? When do we have a conversation as to whether this is mandatory? And going back to the question of scope of this requirement, it really does not say what project this applies to. So does it apply to an alteration? Does it apply to only a building addition? Obviously concept and SDP are mentioned, but it doesn't, there's no scoping as to what projects this applies to. And I believe we have multiple project types that we'd like the DGC to address. I also, it is interesting, someone brought this up, that the process is mentioned here, because most design requirements in the code, we don't include our process because we want our process to be flexible. It does make sense here, like you said, that this should be submitted early on, but we're tying it to terms, concept, SDP, things that are not, I believe, in our code. Maybe they're more process, current process terminology. And it makes sense. It's actually appearing to me to be correct that this should be mentioned here, because the submittal process is an integral part of this. But we usually in code require, even if it's a report, we require it, and then we determine process outside of adopted code. Just a note on that.
Okay, so just to run through a few things, the question on who this might be mandatory for, I think the intention was that it would be an option for all projects. If we don't want it to be an option for all project types, if we think that there are some project types that it just shouldn't be an option for, then we can exclude them. Otherwise, the lack of exclusion of project types was intended to leave this open for everybody to choose, because we thought that this would bring value. And even if a project is just including a small addition, honestly, having that team go through the research to understand the ecosystem and to understand how their addition has no impact or some impact or whatever it may be, they might be doing a bunch of landscape along with their they're building. It's not just about the little piece of building. So the thinking was, let's leave it open for all project types. But if you believe that there are project types that we should say, you may not use this, then we can exclude them. The scope of the requirement, so we talked about that one. I'm just looking, as far as determining mandatory versus not, that conversation won't happen until the end of the cycle. But again, the city team intends to name which provisions will be mandatory versus elective for the pilot path. We may or may not get to discussing that with the committee, but that's going to be at the very end of the process, because we really can't make that definition until we have gone through consideration of all of the provisions. And then as far as making it mandatory for all projects, I think we came to a conclusion that we are not going down that pathway, because there is a whole abundance of support and resources that would be required to give to the community to make this mandatory for every commercial project that we are just simply not set up to provide yet to help everybody succeed. So maybe in the future we can revisit that potential, because having teams shift to that type of thinking is ultimately going to support one of the big pieces of the Denver Green Code that really isn't being forwarded that much in this cycle. So I don't think that that's something that we have to spend a lot of time. I probably shouldn't have even said it out loud. I think the point is that the Denver Green Code, we talked about in the orientation, the fact that the Denver Green Code has two big primary purposes. One is to advance stringency of defined regulations that decrease negative impacts caused by development projects. Another is to change the process and thought and thinking that development teams engage in when they consider what to do on a site. And that second piece is not really being addressed in the Denver Green Code yet. That's a future second half to this regulation that we intend to pursue. And this provision just barely scratches the surface of bringing in that type of thinking so that we can start to introduce this shift in thinking, which is coming.
Thank you. I did not get clarity at all on why we would not want this for projects that are pursuing Denver Green Code, but using other paths.
Because we define those other paths to be complete in and of themselves. I personally would love to see lots of I personally would love to see every project do this, but we had, and we can talk about it at the end, layering this on top of the other path requirements, but that would just have to be a conversation after we've gone through this process. The goal is to keep all four pathways achieving a similar level of benefit and effort across the teams. So in an effort not to complicate things in 2019, we defined those other three pathways in very distinct ways without relying upon threading in parts and pieces of Denver Green Code as written. We could certainly layer this onto all of them because we think that it's really valuable. We hadn't considered that possibility. I think we have to get to the end of the process to determine whether or not that makes sense.
Understood.
Okay, Daniel, if that's it, it looks like it is. We'll move to the next one. Laura, you're up.
All right, if you can hear me now.
Yeah,
I got it. Well, if you could explain a little bit more about how the approval process will work for the narrative statement. If people are having to hire consultants, there's some value tied to getting that narrative statement, and without like a clear path of what's acceptable or approval, there's that uncertainty. So I don't know if that would incentivize people to select that option if they don't know exactly what is deemed appropriate or sufficient in the process.
So similar to something like an environmental impact statement that gets required on a project or other studies of that nature, we would want to see a strong reflection of what research has been done, what research material has been relied upon, which map, for example, if you're going to state which species are of relevance on the site, where did that information come from? We would want to see proof of relevance of the information and data presented and the conclusions drawn from it. It is not possible to define a checklist for how something like this gets studied, because for each project there are going to be unique conditions. I think that generally our development community has a level of sophistication and knowledge to know when they're trying to send us fluff versus doing the actual research required to make informed conclusions. And that's how it would be judged. We're just going to have to see that the team has done its due diligence and is providing good, solid, well-researched information based on recent understandings and studies of the conditions around that site and in Denver.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Adam.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, I have a love-hate relationship with LEED, but I know that this has been connected to LEED. And I think in a lot of ways that's going to benefit the teams that are working on these projects. There is a roadmap already, especially for this credit or this section that's connected to the LEED credit, which is connected to a site assessment worksheet, which can be used, I assume, and that's why it's connected to that site assessment worksheet. So there is precedent for how to document and follow this credit. It shouldn't be a kind of a creative made up thing if you don't have to do it that way. There's guidance on it, and I would just suggest that teams could lean on that already proven guidance from LEED if they want to. Thanks.
Thanks for bringing that up, Adam. I actually was just going to mention that one reason this credit language did go through some evolutions in our development, and one reason why we went with this framework is because there is precedent for documentation, and there are kind of job aids out there already to help with that.
Thanks for that background info. Next up, we have Josh.
Hi. Yeah. So I think as a general statement, I sort of like feel cynical around things that are kind of like process heavy and would rather see us emphasize things that are more outcome specific. So, my experience with these as a lead in the lead context is generally busy work without a lot of direct value in many, if not, most applications. So while I appreciate the good intention, I certainly would be more favorable towards things that are kind of outcome specific, like many of the other things that I think will come up in our agenda today.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask one more time from the committee if there's any more discussion that wants to be had. Okay, seeing no hands go up. This is now where we go, and there was nobody from the general public that spoke in support or opposition, so we won't go back to them for any rebuttal. So now, committee, it's up to you all for somebody on the committee to make a motion, and that could be a motion to approve or a motion to modify, but we need somebody to make a motion to move forward on this. Eric, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Thank you, Kevin. I would like to make a motion to modify, I think it's going to be 103.1.1, so that we can edit the start of the sentence after ecological impact statement. If the committee is open to it, with for commercial buildings, or maybe for new commercial buildings or additions, 25,000 square feet and greater, and then keep the rest of that.
So you're saying right here for new buildings. I'm just going to write it out so that everybody can see. You say 25,000 or greater?
For new commercial buildings or additions, 25,000 square feet or greater.
Okay. Okay, thanks. That is a motion to modify. Is there any other motions or a second? So we do have some other people raising their hands. So Travis, go ahead.
I was thinking for the additions portion that could be if it's greater than 50% of the existing building square footage. That way they're obviously going to be impacting the site rather substantially at that point. Or 25,000 would be I don't know how we word that. 25,000 is the base, and then.
So you're saying
unless it's greater than
additions that have more than 50%?
Yeah. Or 25,000, whichever is, I don't know how to word that code wise, but I think.
Okay.
The point.
Sure, we can work on writing that correctly, but I just want to get that out there. Okay. Next up is Adam. Go ahead, Adam.
I think you need not only commercial, unless you're including multifamily and commercial, I think we need to add multifamily as well. Unless commercial building encompasses all types of commercial building. Is that what we're saying?
We have a motion from Eric. Go ahead and clarify.
Yes, perhaps we could actually use a code reference for International Building Code design buildings. That way it covers everything except IRC, single family duplex and townhomes.
That would be great, Eric. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's see. Next up, it looks like Kristy.
And so just so I'm clear on process, is it okay to comment here? Because I have a comment on the size threshold that I just wanted to throw in, but not a modification that I wanted to propose. I just wanted to make a clarifying comment on it. Is that appropriate for the
Go
stage?
ahead.
Okay,
Sure.
So we can certainly put a 25,000 square foot threshold on it, and that would be fine. I would offer the thought that smaller projects all have an impact on the Denver ecosystem. So if a smaller project doesn't have the option to do this study and to think about the impact that they have on the Denver ecosystem, in my perspective, there's a missed opportunity, because those projects have tremendous interaction with the general public and with the Denver residents, and can have a really positive impact on that ecosystem, as well as a really negative impact on the ecosystem, or just fade into the background and just have unintended consequences. So the goal is to get people thinking about the impact that they can have, and small projects can have enormous positive impact. So to me, it's just a missed opportunity to exclude them from being able to think this way, and to also give them the impression that this doesn't apply to them, because it very much does.
Can I maybe respond to that a little bit? I think the way the language would read is that it would be required for those IBC design buildings, new or greater, with 25,000 square feet or additions and the 50%, but not that smaller buildings would be prohibited from pursuing this. It's just that if you are greater, then you need to do this, right? Because this is a green code mandatory section.
But then we would have to stipulate that it's elective for buildings smaller than 25,000 and mandatory for those greater than 25,000. Otherwise, it's just deemed inapplicable for buildings less than 25,000.
Okay, thanks, Kristy, for your input on that. Next, we have Daniel.
A couple things. What was just mentioned, to have a different requirement for different building types, whether something's mandatory as elective, is going to add a layer of complexity to a complex code that being familiar with the code, I would say, is going to be a huge hurdle for users. But going back to Eric's proposed language, can you clarify, Eric, whether this is new buildings, comma, and additions that are 25,000 or 50%, but it's all new buildings, or is the 25,000 referring to both new and additions? Because if it is referring to both, then I'm not sure what that 50% why an addition would have a different criteria than a new building. They would all be have the same threshold of 25,000. So that could use some clarification.
Right, so the intent of my proposal was that the 25,000 applied to any new building or an addition. I believe Travis's friendly amendment was meant to indicate that, and I don't know if that was really related to building size or perhaps related to lot size. Maybe Travis, you could
Yeah, I can talk to that one. Yeah, so my thoughts here, it is a mixture of just what's the existing building is, how that's going to impact lot size and building envelope in general. But say if we had a 25,000 square foot existing commercial building and they wanted to add more than 12,500 square feet, that would be a big impact on the building in general. And the 50%, I actually specifically had in mind the International Energy Code standard for when you're working on existing buildings. If you affect more than 50% of it, then you're fully subject to the code. So it felt like a pretty reasonable and understandable overlay here, where somebody would be able to recognize it if they're familiar with existing buildings. Does that make sense?
I just want to say in code language, that 50% would apply regardless of whether the existing building is 25,000. There's nothing that you added that stipulates that the 50% addition would be to a building 25,000 or greater. So we have two categories. We have a new building 25,000, we have an addition 25,000, or an addition that's adding more than 50%. Those are three distinct criteria that would trigger the requirement.
Yeah, and I think it's a matter of just cleaning up the language of that first sentence.
Yeah.
Correct. I just wanted to know what the intent was.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Daniel, next would be Austin.
Sorry, can I add one more thing?
Go ahead.
I just want to urge everyone to consider what Kristy's saying is, and it goes to the ecological environment, the social aspects of this investigation and what buildings could bring to the fore, because the 25,000 plus buildings, frankly, are not the institutional in terms of, or the civic. They're not the civic buildings very often. The civic buildings are the libraries and the community centers and things that can often be, a child care. They're things that very much, at least some aspects of this would be extremely pertinent to. And they're not the cookie cutter projects. They're the projects that have tremendous opportunity to be thinking about what's being presented here. And those projects would be excluded.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Austin, you're up next.
I just have a Robert's Rules process question. And if we do not like the proposal with modifications and it gets voted down, is there a chance to also do the proposal as written after that? Or once it's done, is it done?
So thanks for that question. Other people might have that as well. So what will happen is, since the motion on the floor is currently to modify this, we will all vote whether you want to accept the modification. If that passes, then we will vote to see if we approve the modification or approve it as written now. If it doesn't pass with the modifications, we would then go back to the original and ask for a motion there if we want to pass it, if someone wants to pass it as originally written. So thanks for that. Hopefully that clarifies. Next up, Jonathan.
Thanks. So I appreciate Josh's point about this feeling a little bit more process oriented than outcome oriented. But that being said, I guess, assuming this is something that was to be adopted, I guess, sort of tacking on to Kristy's comment, I feel like leaving out residential is a missed opportunity. This sort of making it specifically the commercial feels kind of like a mistake. I mean, I feel like a lot of these points that are addressed in this are most relevant in Denver for sort of greenfield single family projects and sprawl. So I would like to see residential included in this.
Okay, so are you, Jonathan, are you proposing on top of Eric's modification, something else to modify on there?
I guess I'm proposing to reduce commercial and reduce the 25,000 square foot threshold that we put in.
Okay, so you would like to see that 25,000 and the commercial changed. Okay. So unfortunately, since if Eric wants to change it, that's fine, but we would have to go through the process first of turning this down, if it gets turned down, before we can make those changes. But Eric could, since he made the original motion, suggest to make those modifications. So in the meantime, we'll move to the next person, Courtney.
Thanks, Kevin. I feel like I have a very similar comment, so I don't know if this is the appropriate time, but I think I get why the 25,000 was chosen, because that's a common threshold in Denver. But this is a provision within the larger Denver Green Code, and I think we need to start to identify smaller thresholds, which can impact a lot of projects. Like a 23,000 square foot project still makes a very large impact in Denver. So does a 10,000 square foot. So again, I don't know if this is appropriate time, but my motion would be to reduce that 25,000 square feet as well, maybe to 15,000 square feet, but we can revisit that.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. So with that, I don't see any more hands up. Actually, we just got one more. Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe this is more process, but so my interest would be to, and I'm not going to make this motion right now, but motion to, I don't know what the right word is, scuttle this proposal, and then essentially like suggest that we discuss ways to build in the outcomes that we want to see from this process into a different type of proposal. So, I guess the reason I'm asking a process question is because if we're going to keep it, then I agree that the modifications that we're talking about make sense. So in this case, would I vote yes for the modifications and then vote no in terms of approving it, or just make a different motion that we scuttle it and talk about outcomes?
Okay, sure. So what we'll do is we do have to, unless Eric withdraws his motion, we have to go through that motion and vote as a committee. He can still make modifications to that based on the feedback from the committee. You know, that's exactly what this is for. So I'm glad you all are speaking up on how you feel that you want to see things written. So Daniel, go ahead.
I think you need to clarify, sounds like, that voting on this as modified is a final vote, meaning there isn't another layer of vote afterwards after it's modified to vote it up or down. It's a single vote, correct?
No, that is not correct. So
not correct.
That is not correct. It can be turned down and be modified again.
No. The other way. If it's approved as modified, then that there isn't another layer, because I think what was just suggested is to approve the modification, but then to not approve the overall amendment, but that's not an option.
That's correct. So the idea is to get all the insight from you all with Eric's original modification in this one modification, and that is the final modification that we will have for it. We don't want to keep having a call for a vote for a second modification, a third modification, a fourth modification. So what we want to do is make sure that all the modifications get made under this one motion.
And approving that motion would approve the amendment.
No, it would approve the modification to go for a vote to approve or disapprove.
Got it. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. So, and one other thing, before I vote, I would need to understand, and I've asked this before, but it's not clear to me. If I vote, let's say, to modify and to approve, is that a vote to approve it as mandatory, or can I reserve that we'd like to change it to elective later on? Is that, I just need to understand if that language, mandatory versus elective, is part of what we're voting on.
We're not voting
Sure.
on mandatory and elective. That's a conversation at the end of this process. That may change.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Right, so
next up, Eric.
I guess one, well, I've heard quite a suite of different perspectives on revising the applicability to commercial and residential buildings, to the square footage of 25,000 or something different than that. But I don't know if I've heard something in terms of specifically editing the wording, which I'm open to, but someone would need to propose that, because I mean, one thing I could say is, okay, change the 25 to 15, but I don't think that covers some of the other things that folks were saying. So I would recommend that you speak up to propose what exactly should be changed, and the committee can agree or disagree with that.
Okay, thanks. Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, this is going to be a quick comment, but you all should realize, looking down the road at the other 18 or 20 or 31s of these that we have to look at, that you're going to have to add that first line to every single one. And it doesn't really make much sense to me to do that, seeing that the way it was developed in the first place, according to Kristy, was that they're going to be optional. So just think about that as we're voting. Thanks.
Great. Jason, go ahead.
I'm still confused on the optional, elective, and mandatory. So I realize that we're voting on something that says in writing mandatory, but yet then it's going to be an option or an elective later. That's still confusing to me.
So let me go through that again. The Denver Green Code has two different separate uses. One is for all commercial projects. One is for just the pilots. So with the 2019, we have 6 pilots. Pilots choose to comply with a much higher level of stringency. It's a small number of projects. They were incentivized in 2019. They'll probably be incentivized with the 2022 Denver Green Code, but we don't know that for sure. For the pilots, there are defined mandatories, and then you choose from a set of electives a certain number, or choose one of the other 3 pathways for compliance. So kind of like LEED. For the 2022 limited mandatory use on all commercial projects, there is not a single provision in the Denver Green Code that we are proposing will be mandatory for every single project. What we are saying is that at the end of this process, the city team will say, you must pick 2 from this chapter, 3 from that chapter, 1 from that chapter. And what we will choose is a very tiny number that simply gives teams the opportunity to choose things, based on our understanding of these provisions. And we have a good understanding of these provisions and what we see with projects that come through the door, that what we're asking for is very, very minimal and attainable for every project team. Because the point is to get everybody to read it. The point is not to make it super hard or hard for all commercial projects to use this. The point is for every commercial project team to be able to meet those mandatory limited use requirements just by reading and picking the things that apply to their project. So when you see mandatory, that is not relevant to the conversation about use of commercial projects. It is only relevant for the one path, which is one of 4 potential pathways, for the one path using Denver Green Code as written for pilot commercial project compliance.
Okay, Jason, I hope that answered your question. If not, it sounds like your hand's down, so I'll move on. Next up would be Daniel.
Kristy, I'm still so confused. I asked a moment ago, if I vote on this to affirm and to adopt, let's say as written, as an amendment, is this going to be a mandatory section in the Denver Green Code, in the prescriptive path, or can it later be determined that it's going to be an elective, just like there are many other electives within the Denver Green Code? And you said that it could be determined later that this would be an elective, meaning not every project that wants to use the Denver Green Code prescriptive path would need to meet this. They could choose to meet it as one of their required electives. Again, for DGC projects, for those pilot, whatever you want to call them. So I'm sorry that the terminology is confusing, but I'm certainly confused. If not, maybe others are as well.
So the mandatory or elective designation only pertains to the pilot project pathway that is called Denver Green Code as written. And the mandatory and elective designations will be finalized at the end of this process. So these are preliminary designations that have been laid out there, roughly. They're going to change because right now the designations that we carried from the 2019 Denver Green Code supported a lower level of achievement for projects than what the 2022 is going to be updated to achieve for those pilots. So we know some of those electives are going to become mandatory, or a larger number of electives will become required to be selected. We know that some designations will change at the end, but we cannot make that assessment until we know what we're actually working with as far as the total provisions that can go into that. Just like in the 2019 process, for anybody who followed that, at the end of the process, we made a determination on which ones would be mandatory and elective for teams following the pilot. It's not possible for us to designate those along the way because we don't know what's going to be suggested to move forward to city council versus not. And our goal is one collective level of performance once we group everything together. So it will be discussed again at the end. These were preliminary designations that we thought were relevant, but we don't know that that's going to be the final determination, so we can talk about it.
Okay, so if someone on the committee, just to be clear, wants to see this in the code in any capacity, servicing electives or as a mandate, they would vote to include the amendment.
Yes.
Thank you.
Next up, Jonathan.
Okay, so if I understood what Eric said before, if I wanted to change the language, do I make a motion?
I'm open to a
You could,
Jonathan, if you'd like to propose changing what I proposed, I'm open to that and potentially we'll agree with it.
Okay, so I guess what I would propose is that to remove commercial. So it just says for new buildings. I mean, like I would be in favor of making the square footage something that's anything larger than like an ADU. So I don't know, 1,000 square feet. And then addition to adding more than 50% square footage would work. So I guess that would be my proposal.
okay.
Yeah,
Eric,
I'm fine with the new buildings. So it can apply to residential. In my opinion, reducing that square footage value down to something as small as 1,000, at that point, I would say just take it out and make it for all new buildings. I mean, I'm not sure how many new buildings we have that are much smaller than 1,000, in total area. Like you said, maybe an ADU.
Right, that's essentially just sort of trying not to catch up something like that in it.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly what that threshold is.
I'm open to that.
Okay, so as it stands right now, Eric, your motion is this, but potentially also could change this 25,000 square foot one. Next up is Christopher.
Hi, I'm wondering if, for the sake of clarity, if there's any way we could just remove the verbiage mandatory from this, because I think that that's what everyone's stuck on.
Okay, that would have to, since Eric made the motion, that would have to come for him if he wants to do that. We'll give him some time to think that over because we have another hand up. If that's all you had, Christopher, that looks like it. Okay, next up would be Renee.
Hi, everyone. I struggle with how much time commitment this would be for a project team and what the direct impact would be. I mean, recording where you're at is one thing that takes time in each one of those categories. But if you're not actually requiring anything other than documentation, I'm just not really sure what the impact is. I guess I would vote for the higher square footage being mandatory. And I don't know if I had to go to another meeting for half an hour of this, so I didn't get the whole conversation. But if anybody's talked about like, well, how many hours of this would it even take? And how much would that cost for someone to do it? And is that reasonable for a small project? Just wondered.
So
Okay.
I think just going back to something that was said earlier to answer that question, if it's not reasonable for a small project, they don't need to choose it. And that's a really fundamental thing that we all need to, everybody has to understand with the Denver Green Code. Not every provision is intended to apply logically to every project type, because it's a code where you choose things. The point is to make people familiar with different concepts that apply to development in Denver, but not for every provision to be applicable to every project. So for a small project team to do this study might take time and resources that don't make sense in their mind. But if it were something that resonated with them, they could certainly pursue it because their project does have the potential for impact. And it's to make them familiar with this way of thinking and this different way of approaching development, even if they choose not to pursue that because it's not cost effective for their small project, because there are other things that they can choose that are.
Thank you.
Next up, Jason.
So to go along with that and kind of go along with what Chris said, if everything's going to be something that buildings can pick or choose, why does any of it need to say mandatory at all? That's just where I'm hung up on is that if it says that, plus later we're going to decide if it's mandatory or elective, and then on top of that, someone could choose whether to do it or not. Why does it need to say mandatory in the actual proposal or in the amendment?
And we can certainly change the language conventions. Once we finish this, we'll have to refine the language, and I would propose that this is something that we should put onto the side burner so that we can figure out the technicalities of doing this. There will be a need for us to identify which provisions for pilot projects are mandatory and electives. For all other projects, they are simply provisions and all are fair game. So if we want to take it out of the proposal with the understanding that we will think about how to fix that language so that it's more clear for the community, I think that makes sense. I'm good with that.
Okay. Next up, Daniel.
I'd also like to see that happen now for clarity, Eric, if you'd be okay with that, because I don't want, one reason I'm thinking this as being mandatory for DGC projects might be a mistake is that if it is a huge hurdle or cost for certain smaller projects that's not reasonable to them, they'll abandon this path in the DGC altogether. So as much as we want people to, especially when typical projects in Denver are looking at the code to familiarize themselves with it because they need to, certainly they want to become familiar with this section. I'm sure this section will have, if it's adopted, a lot of impact in the future, but for right now, it's new, it hasn't been tested. If anything, it might discourage projects from using this path if it's locked in. You can't use this path without it, using the mandatory section. So again, we're not deciding right now if it's mandatory or not, but to make that clear, it would give us a level of comfort in voting.
Sorry. Yes, so to help provide clarity in this, and I think it's going to be relevant, and so we can talk about it as a committee for other proposals that are upcoming. But to move on with this one, I'm fine to strike the mandatory at the beginning, and the city will come back at the end of the process to reevaluate these. And then finally, I believe Jonathan, if I recall correctly, was proposing to change the 25,000 square feet to just 1,000, which I am fine with. So that could be changed to 1,000 square feet. And with that, and recognizing the time that we've just spent on this first proposal, unless there are any other substantive questions or comments to change this, I see Daniel, but I'd like to reserve the right to call the vote. So go ahead, Daniel, or Kevin, back to you.
Sure. Yeah, Daniel, if you have any last thing to add real quick, go ahead.
It sounds to me that there's a lot of interest here not to have the 25,000 square feet. And if we don't have, and it was changed now to 1,000, then the 50% for an addition, again, just means either 50% of 1,000 square feet, it's not clear, or it means 50% of any addition, which could be, you know, a 500,000 square foot addition, but it's less than 50% of the building. So I don't think the Travis intended for 50% square footage to be unlimited, you know, 45, you know, less than 50% being a huge addition. So I just think, you know, I would encourage Eric to take out, you know, the changes altogether in this regard. I wouldn't be able to vote for it to say more than 50% square footage on an addition, because that would mean, again, anything less than 50% would be okay, regardless of size.
Right. So yeah, I hear that. I don't intend to make further revisions to the modification. And I would suggest if the rest of the committee has similar feelings to Daniel, then they vote down the proposed modification and then make a new motion on the amendment as it was originally proposed without modification.
Okay, thank you. We will need a second from Eric's motion to modify this. Jason, if you have something to add, I see your hand up.
Could you just put for new buildings, additions that are less than 1,000, additions parentheses, less than 1,000 feet that are adding more than 50% square footage? Would that get you what you need?
I'm not sure if I quite followed that, but maybe you're speaking to Daniel in terms of trying to provide the clarity.
Yeah, just if you had additions and then parentheses less than 1,000 feet, then end parentheses, would that then include what you wanted?
I'm not going to second this one. So unless you're seconding, you're proposing to make this language change and second, it would be clear in terms of what Travis maybe might intend to do. But I'm not seconding it in any case. So
yeah, I think mine was probably, we could have fixed by 50% of the existing building square footage, but I'm also not gonna second this either, so we're good.
Okay, so we do need a second from the floor. Is there a second? Someone needs to second so we can vote.
No, excuse me, Kevin, point of order. If there's no second, the motion dies.
I'm
okay.
sorry.
Oh, Courtney, you second it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So now that we will call a vote. So the vote is to approve this proposal's modifications that we modified. So remember, we took out the mandatory up here, and then we also modified this the sentence, which will need to be codified, if you will. But for all intents and purposes, this is what you're voting on with a slight change, potential wording, so it actually makes sense. So with all those in favor of that, please raise your hand. Oh, okay, we got 5. So go ahead and lower your hand. I forgot, I'm gonna back up. I forgot to do something here. I'm gonna ask our note taker to make sure, one, we have quorum. And then 2, to let us know how many voting members we have, because majority rules on this. So if you can tell us how many voting members we have, that would be great.
We do have quorum, and it looks like we have 16 voting members.
Okay, so 16 voting members means that we would need 9 people to pass at this time. So, okay, so we already voted for, we had 5. All those opposed, please raise your hand. Okay, those are coming in. We have 9 of those. So that would be 16. Go ahead and lower your hand. There aren't any abstentions because that equals 16. Oh, sorry. My math was wrong there. All of those abstaining from this, please raise your hand. Okay, so the motion does not pass to be modified. Now, what we'll do, give me a second. I'm going to open it back up for a discussion for a few minutes. I don't want to let you all have all the time in the world, but it's going to take me a minute to reopen the original one. So while I do that, if anybody wants to speak or make a motion for the original proposal as written, please raise your hand. Daniel, go ahead.
I'd like to propose the amendment as written, except for one modification, to remove the word mandatory.
Okay, thank you. Is there a second on that? Kristy, go ahead.
I would second that.
Okay, there's a second. All right, so I'm going to make that change. Give me 1 second. So we do have to vote again on the motion to modify the original proposal, which is now written on the screen with taking out the words of mandatory. So that is what you're voting on, is just to take out the words mandatory. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Voting still coming in. Still coming in. Okay, lower your hands. It's 11.
And sorry, I miscounted, Kevin. Someone came in late. So there are 17 voting members.
Okay, we have 17. That doesn't change anything from the past, so that's good. All those opposed, please raise your hand. Okay, I got 4. Go ahead and lower. And all those abstaining, please raise your hand. Okay, I have a total of 15 people that have voted. So 11 for the modification and 4 against. All right, so that passes. Now we are going to vote on this as written. So all those in favor, I'm sorry, I need a motion, a new motion now to approve this as written on the screen. Austin, go ahead.
Motion to approve as written on screen.
Okay, and is there a second?
Second.
Courtney, okay, I see Courtney's hand. All right, so all those in favor of passing this proposal as written on the screen, please raise your hand. Okay, I see. Give me 1 second. I do see somebody from the general public that is voting. I want to make sure they're not on the committee, just so we have an accurate count. And I'm looking, okay, they are not. So we have 12 for, so go ahead and lower your hand. My hands are not lowered. I'm going to lower everybody's hands for you. Okay, all those opposed, please raise your hand. Okay, I have 3. So go ahead and lower your hand. Sorry, there's a 4th one that just went up. So that would make 16. All right, so this passes 12-4. That this proposal now goes through. Thank you all for that. We'll move on to the next one. Not too bad. We got through the first one in an hour. So we knew that this first one was going to take a little bit longer, so don't worry about that. We won't take a break yet. Let's get through one more and then we'll take our break. The next item up for business is item number 26. And I believe, Kristen, do you want to go ahead and start giving us a summary on this while I pull it up?
Yeah, sure. So this one hopefully will be substantially less controversial. Our concept was really here was to limit turf grass to only the areas that were going to be walked on. We thought that medians and other ground cover not intended for walking. Sorry, excuse me, let me start again. So the intention here is really to limit turf grass to only stuff that's going to be walked on. So we thought that something in a median or anything that's not really going to be walked on or used for a functional area should be something else. So something that might be drought tolerant or native or some type of self-sustaining permaculture landscape. So this includes new construction only, and that includes residential and non-residential construction. We wanted to limit this to just functional areas, as I said. So we've got a pretty robust definition that we'll add to chapter 3 for what functional areas are. Anywhere where you can run, play, walk, stroll, right? For humans, we also have some designated pet recreation areas in there as well. Really, we're trying to limit the new installation of any type of turf grass. And hopefully that will save about 15% in water use for landscaping and turf grass. And this was kind of modeled after a similar code proposal in Las Vegas, where they basically eliminated all of the turf grass in medians and areas that weren't really useful. And they replaced that with other type of drought tolerant planting materials.
Okay, thanks for the summary, Kristen. I'll move, committee hold tight. I'm going to move it over to the public. Anybody in from the public that wants to speak in support, please raise your hand. Anybody from the public that wants to speak in support, please raise your hand. Third and final call. Anybody from the public that wants to speak in support, raise your hand. Seeing none. General public, anybody that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Third and final call for the general public to speak in opposition. Okay, seeing none. I'll turn it back over to you, committee. Now it is your turn to have conversation and discuss. So I did see a hand go up, but it went down. Anybody have? There we go. Scott, go ahead and you're up first.
Great, thank you. Just quick question and clarification on how tree lawns are handled in this definition.
That's a great question. I think that's probably considered a walkable surface. I don't know if someone from the city wants to chime in on tree lawns. I'm assuming that you're just talking about area beneath tree plantings.
Yeah, the right of way between the street and property boundary. I'm thinking in residential, but applies to all projects.
Could we scroll down in the proposal a little bit? I think it mentioned square or footages lower down. Maybe I was wrong though.
There's another proposal that you might be.
Yeah, it's in the other one. Okay.
Yep.
This is
okay, Scott.
Sorry, this is Eric to answer the question. I would say that the idea would be, where you've got a tree line that's adjacent to a sidewalk, which perhaps by definition that's what a tree line is, adjacent to the sidewalk versus just adjacent to the roadway. But for those, I would think a tree lawn would be a functional area. For debate by the committee though, and we could certainly define it more clearly. I guess the question is, how valuable is that as turf grass in terms of maintenance, water usage, contamination from the roadway, that sort of thing. So we could easily intentionally include or exclude that from functional area.
Okay, so Scott, for your question, it sounds like when we get to the time, you can make a motion to add a definition or clarify that, if that's okay with you. So from there, we'll move on. Next up is Jeff.
Thank you.
Yeah, Scott covered one of mine, which is those tree lawn areas, and the term walkable needs to be very well defined because it can be very subjective. What is walkable and what is not? Like, how often do you walk across a site? Who's walking across that area? Is it for pets and others? So I think that needs to be really tightened up in there. I think it's also really needs to be very specific as to what turf types. And even in one of the supporting documents, it talks about warm season turf grass requiring less water. And I think just saying that you're not going to allow any turf grass in these areas is really being overly prescriptive, and you're kicking out a lot of really good low water and drought adapted turf grasses that are warm season or that are adapted. So I think there needs to be something about high water use, or use Kentucky bluegrass to be more specific on that. And the last one, maybe a little nitpicky, but exemptions for turf blocks and grass pavers. Those are areas that are traditionally, those are the interlocking concrete planters, I believe, for, you could drive across. I don't know why we would exempt those areas from being a higher water use or a turf area or an irrigated higher. I think those should also be lower water use, just because they're hard to irrigate and you don't really want to irrigate those sites. So I would remove that.
Okay, Kristen, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we included this in here specific. I see what you're saying. I think we were thinking about, areas where fire trucks, might need to get closer to a building, right? And they might need to have, that stability area. But I understand that those aren't areas particularly that ever get mowed, and usually, whatever type of landscaping within those blocks is probably more of a drought resistant species anyways.
And what about changing it to Kentucky bluegrass or high water use? It's cool season turf.
Yeah, I think we were trying to stay away from species selection, but I'm not opposed to that.
So Jeff, again, if that's your recommendation, be prepared on how you may want to modify this in a motion. But it sounds like that's probably all of your questions that Kristen was able to answer. So yes. For that, we'll move to Travis.
I think Jeff brought up a bunch of really good points. I like those. Probably just modifying that area that's being replaced with drought tolerant and tagging some stuff in there is interesting. I had a general question about, we're diving into, and this is for pretty much all the rest of the amendments here that are in chapter 5. I don't want to derail us too much, but am I understanding section 101.4 correctly, where, if you're applying with one of these 3 things, so if you're net zero or a passive house, essentially, you wouldn't have to apply to any of this chapter 5 stuff at all?
Yes,
I can answer that one.
Go ahead.
Sorry to jump in. So that designation is for Denver Green Code full pilot compliance. So technically that would be true, yes. Because and Eric, jump in here if I'm saying something that we haven't discussed, but that I have in my brain. If a project is following one of the 4 Denver Green Code pilot compliance pathways, then they are considered to be in compliance with Denver Green Code requirements, which means that that project would not also have to comply with all mandatory limited use requirements for all commercial projects. But Eric, I need you to confirm that because we haven't discussed that.
That's confirmed.
Okay. I don't want to derail us too much here. I was at one point, could we talk about a little bit of that? There's some amendments later in chapter 5 here that I don't see why, if you're doing a net zero property, you shouldn't be restricted to doing like accommodating pollinators and stuff. Like, I think that's really good stuff, thinking about invertebrates. So is that something we would sidebar at the end of this entire process and talk about, or is it just, am I just blowing wind right now?
I think it's a good point because we hadn't talked about it internally. I would be open to discussing as a committee, do we want the limited use to apply to projects, even if they're pursuing a pilot? Because again, the limited mandatory use just gets people to read and comply with a few things. It's a low bar with what actually has to be put into a project. So I'd be open to, if the committee wants to recommend and believes that that's absorbable for the community, I think it's totally reasonable to say that that limited mandatory use would apply to pilot projects as well.
Thank you. I'm curious. I don't think this one really affects what I'm thinking of. It's more later chapter 5 ones, but anyway, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, next up is Daniel.
I do agree with the people who spoke to that it's unclear, and I think this won't be the only section, but it's unclear in general in the Denver Green Code what some of these plants are and what plant lists to look at when one's looking for a drought tolerant or what is turf grass. And I think not just for this amendment, but in general across the code, maybe Kristy could speak to this. Have we made any strides in having some defined terms and some standards that, you know, the way we do in other codes? I think that would be super helpful. It wouldn't change how we approve or disapprove this particular amendment. I think we could approve it with the intent that there will be defined terms for turf grass if we can come up with them, and there would be defined terms for drought tolerant and what standard to use to determine that, and things like that. I don't think it would have to affect this particular amendment, but it would be good to understand, Kristy, if we're pursuing that. The other question I had is, why is there an exception for residential yards and lawns, and what is that intended for? Because again, we have a defined, residential is a defined term in the Green Code, and it might not be the residential we're thinking of here. It might, you know, commercial, larger multifamily would maybe not be residential. I'm not sure if they should not have a yard or lawn. In general, why are we excluding a yard or lawn for some buildings and not for other, or some building types and not other building types if it's not, again, not walkable, not a play area, not a sports field, not, you know, it has no functionality.
I can certainly speak to that, Daniel, in terms of, you know, walkable turf grass or functional areas. And as it's related to residential, I think that it is far more subjective in terms of what is functional from a residential perspective. If you've got an office building and you just, you know, plant an acre of turf grass next to the parking lot, it's hard to argue that that's functional. But if you have a yard or, you know, any other space adjacent to either multifamily or single family residential, I think very reasonably that could be argued as functional for kids, you know, pets, that sort of thing. It's where people live. And as a first or an introductory step in trying to limit turf grass, I would be very concerned about, quite frankly, trying to push too hard or go too far and incorporate residential into that. That just doesn't feel like it's going to sit very well with the community, and they're going to feel like, you know, Denver's telling them to tear their yards out, that sort of thing. Maybe that's exaggerating a bit, but that's why residential is excluded.
So it would help me if just everyone should be aware there's a residential project, I think, definition that residential projects are limited to single family and duplex and townhomes. This residential probably means a residential use, and maybe that needs to be clarified, maybe not. But the intent here, and if it needs to be clarified in terms of code language, we could do that even later on, but the intent here would be residential use.
Correct, to include multifamily.
Okay.
And
Okay,
then
next up is
Daniel,
Austin.
well,
Oh,
I'd
go
like
ahead.
to answer Daniel's first question, which has to do with definitions for drought tolerant and which standards to use. There is a separate proposal pertaining to water use and landscape. And I'm sorry, I can't speak to the specifics off the top of my head today. I just haven't refreshed my memory on it in some time, but we can definitely make sure that those definitions get incorporated. I just can't recall if we already incorporated them. And Kristen, maybe you can recall. My brain's just too fuzzy right this instant.
I think there are there's the landscape requirements that we're going to talk about next, but we also really did not talk about species in that. There is a public proposal from Western Resources group that does talk about planting types, but there is no species list for that proposal either.
So would it be possible for someone to propose a modification with just the intent to modify to coordinate between the proposals and to use definitions that are the same across the board in all our landscaping requirements when we speak about whether it's turf grass or drought tolerant and native?
Yes,
We
it is
can.
possible for someone to make that.
Thank you.
I would just make a suggestion just for clarity so that we all are talking about the same thing. We can suggest some criteria related to that. We don't have plant lists right now that we would put forth as the species list to choose from. So we don't want to get to that level of specificity. We have talked about the relevance of such things, and there's ongoing conversation about how we can get to a point where we can be more specific about those types of choices so that we are taking into consideration all the factors that are relevant to a list like that related to the ecosystem, not just water. But we could definitely go down the path of defining what we mean for now relative to drought tolerant and other broader designations.
Okay, next up is Austin.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add on to what a lot of people have been saying, but we need further definition on functional and non-functional and kind of where medians end and parkways begin, because I know the parkway design guidelines really point towards using turf grass for a very specific look and feel. Some of them being protected by historic designation makes it even harder to change them away from turf grass. But if this is really about saving water, we need to kind of get into what the self-sustaining permaculture means definition wise, because if we're suggesting that there's some sort of plant species that are of agronomic quality, they could use far more water than turf grass and still be kind of accepted under the current definitions in here. So I just think this proposal has a long way to go before it's anything that I could vote on.
Okay, next up is Renee. Renee, you're on mute.
Hi.
There you go.
So I would just, the functional versus non-functional part of it, I would recommend that be the name of it instead of walkable. People will argue about what's walkable and what's not walkable. But I think the intent is that it's functional versus non-functional areas and defining those better. I agree. I was interested in the 15% savings from the Nevada bill on the next page, and curious, and I couldn't find it from the link, if that bill included what we were talking about, which was the tree lined grass areas, because I think that area between the sidewalk and the road that's often grass could be a big, water saving part of it. So I think that's a big question mark in my mind. I'd love to see that just not be turf grass, but I don't know if that'll work in residential areas.
So the 15% savings in Nevada, I'm not sure how many trees that they really have. But this was really specifically to roadway medians and in like commercial office parks. So that's where they were saving most of the water, because all of that stuff was just completely turf. And so they just replaced it with something else. So that's where they got the savings from. So they were talking about a little bit of a different area. It did not mention the under trees. So I'm not sure about that. I do like your recommendation about the topic or the title of this proposal.
And if I can just add a little bit on the right-of-way area, part of the reason why we didn't include the right-of-way area necessarily or are shying away from that is not because we don't think that that's a really high impact area, because we do. It's because right now there is ongoing conversation to try to get all of the mandatory regulations supportive and in alignment with the things that we would be aspiring towards here. So we have a couple choices here, but basically that's a sort of circumspect way of saying there are enough regulations in place right now that govern the right of way, that turf grass is one of the only options that teams are left to putting there right now. And we would love to get to a point where we can alter that. So we could propose to include that in this provision. It makes it challenging for teams to come up with an alternative solution. But on the flip side, it could inspire creativity from teams to find solutions that haven't been thought of before that meet all of the current DOTI requirements that govern what can go in the right of way. So I would not be opposed to that. That's a really impactful strip that we would like to evolve along with the private property. I think we were cautious about looping it in because right now we are still working to get all minds collaborating together so that we can actually advance similar priorities in both zones.
Okay, Kristy, your hand was up next, so if you want to continue, that's fine. Oh, you're muted there. Didn't quite hear you. Oh, I think
sorry,
you're
just
done.
needed to put my hand down.
Oh, that's fine. Josh, you're up.
Yeah, so I like this one. I guess a question, like, do we state the intention of each one at the top anywhere? Am I missing that?
The intention is usually at the in the supporting information.
I was looking at that and okay, anyway, I mean, I think we should just be clear that this is about more than just water savings, that it's about water savings, but it's also about ecological health and, reduce mowing and reduce fertilizer and all that kind of stuff. I think, having said that, just the sort of two comments I'd like to see. I mean, there's a few sort of helpful amendments that people have talked about. One would be, just broaden the idea of functional areas. I teach at CU and it's great to have turf grass to go sit on. I guess that's walkable, whatever. I just want to make sure we don't sort of lose sight of that. And on the flip side, I think there are some sort of water use, maybe more water use intensive landscapes that are intentional, like various gardens that may not be native that I wouldn't want to be overly restrictive towards. So I'd like to be able to sort of accommodate, selective type of sort of like, and I'm not a landscape designer to be able to sort of come up with the right terminology, but sort of to allow things that are deliberate and intentional in a certain way, even if they happen to be water using, but and these are things that I'm thinking of that are not necessarily turf. So stumbled on that, but hopefully you get my drift. Thank you.
Next up is Austin.
Yeah, I think I would like to see the modifications for this to comply with what we currently have in the green code, and then some of the other things that will come up in proposals both the next one and some of the things that Western Resource Advocates are proposing. So I think some of this gets tackled by what's currently in the Green Code of giving designers kind of the ability to design to a gallons per square foot, and by lowering our gallons per square foot, you're naturally removing some of the non-functional turf areas because they want to concentrate on the areas that are being used, and that moves you towards only putting turf grass where you absolutely need it, and then putting in low water plant species where people aren't necessarily trying to recreate or do things like that. So I think there's already a bit of that in the existing code. And I would just like to see this proposal reference that portion of the code. I don't have the number memorized where that is though.
Okay, thanks, Austin. I don't see any more hands up. So is there a motion? Does anybody want to make a motion? Daniel, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
I would like to propose that this amendment be approved with the intent to modify to provide a definition for turf grass and a definition for drought tolerant, native, or functional, and for those definitions to be coordinated with other sections of the Green Code, and for those definitions to be proposed by a subcommittee of this group of experts in that area.
Okay, sorry, I was trying to write that down as you were speaking. Thank you, Daniel. Is there a second on that? Please raise your hand if there is.
A second.
Eric, go ahead. Oh, Eric, seconds? Okay.
A second, yeah.
Great. So committee, we are going to call a vote then for Daniel's motion to approve with the intent to modify at a later date with a subcommittee of these of you all to provide a definition of turf grass, a couple definitions, and correct me if I'm wrong. Turf grass, and native, something with native. I couldn't quite write that down, and to be coordinated with the Green Code. So that is what you are voting on. I see a couple hands that went up. So if there are questions before we vote, I will allow that. Austin, go ahead.
Daniel, would you be open to including further definition of functional and non-functional turf?
I'm sorry, there's two functionals here, so it's confusing. There's functional areas, which is already a defined term. We can, the definition is in the proposal. We can talk about making modifications to the definition, but that's functional areas. There's another functional, which is what is allowed to be planted anywhere, which is drought tolerant, native, or functional plants. So the first functional areas, we already have a definition. I was not proposing to change that. The second functional, all three of those, drought tolerant, native, or functional, I was proposing that a subcommittee work on some definition.
I was going back to a previous commenter that was saying only walkable turf grass should be defined as functional turf grass.
I think what they were suggesting, and I'm amenable to that, is that in the second sentence of the proposal, it says limited to functional areas that require it as a recreational or walkable surface. I think they were asking, why do we talk about walkable if functional area is already defined? I'm open to.
Actually, I think I was just suggesting that the name of the bill be changed so it's not called only walkable turf grass. That is called functional versus non-functional turf grass.
Okay, yeah, I'm totally open to that. Change the walkable, the title of to functional to functional or only functional turf grass.
Okay, seeing no more hands, there's a call to vote now. All those in favor of approving this proposal as written with the intent to provide definitions of turf grass, native, and functional from a committee and be coordinated with the Green Code, please raise your hand. Okay, we have 18 voting members. We have 16 for. Go ahead and lower your hands. Okay, all those opposed, please raise your hand. I don't see any. All those abstaining, please raise your hand. Don't see any. Okay, so this passes as written with the intent to modify those definitions from a committee member. If there's anybody that would like to be part of that committee member, please raise your hand so we can make note of that, so we can get a hold of you and have a subcommittee be part of that, writing those definitions. So I believe, Kara, you're the note taker. If you please would write these names down. We got Kristy, Austin, Jeff, and Courtney that would like to be a part of that subcommittee. All right, so with that being said, we will take a break. Thank you all for that. We are going to take, because we're running late on time, we're going to take an 8-minute break here. Feel free to turn off your camera, go do what you need to do. When the time expires, we'll come back. Eric, if you're on, I did get your note about Antonio adding in as a panelist.
Yes, thank you. I saw that and I appreciate it. And that was my fault and on me, and I'm working to get that updated and coordinated on our end and on the website, so it's clear to everyone that Antonio is a committee member.
Okay, yeah, I didn't see him on my list, so thanks for.
Yeah, no, my fault. That's I heard you say, it's like, wait a minute, what do you mean he's not on the list? So I had to scramble a bit and check there. So that's on me and should be good going forward.
Okay, so Kara, our note taker, just please take note that we do have another voting member on there, which I think it brings us up to what I think 18 now.
Kevin,
Yeah, 18.
Real quick, you don't have Jeff as a voting member, correct?
Don't believe so.
Okay.
No, I don't see him.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so if you can hear me, please turn your cameras back on. We'll get started. I will say, I do want to thank you all for being a part of this. This is very good input that you've all had so far as a community. This is what makes Denver great, and you also passionate about your jobs is all these conversations. So don't want to let that go unspoken, but thank you all for your time commitment on this. One other housekeeping rule item I want to point out is that you all have been very good with keeping your cameras on and turning them off as need be. So please remember to keep doing that. I did see, I'm guilty of it too. I did see a couple phones come up and everything. Just turn your camera off if you need to attend to that. So thank you all. We will get started now on the next proposal, item number 28. Kristen, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Okay. I'm getting the notice for like low system, like audio quality. So tell me if you can't hear me correctly. I try to close it.
We can hear you, but it's a little slow. So
okay. It's slow.
Go ahead.
Okay. Let me see if there's anything I can do about that. Is it better now? Is it better if I stop my video?
Sure.
Okay.
Yep, that's fine.
Unstable connection, so I apologize. Hopefully we can get through this and you guys can comment on it. So this is the landscape requirements proposal. This is related to all new construction, residential and commercial projects. So single unit and duplex dwellings and multifamily. So this proposal kind of has changed a little bit over time to kind of work with the Western Resources Advocates proposal. Right now, this really outlines a couple of different areas and good landscape practices, including the minimum area, density, and then diversity of plant materials, kind of giving flexibility as much as possible. So you'll see the minimum landscape area. We have some definitions in terms of minimum sizes. We're asking for density in terms of tree and shrub count. So this is really to promote and keeping with the character of Denver landscape. Hopefully providing a network of pollinators and tree canopy to reduce heat island effect. We left out the biodiverse planting materials, including drought tolerant, any type of irrigation or soil amendments, because that will be discussed in the Western Resources Advocates proposal, which we'll hear in, I think it's code hearing number 6. So I guess you guys have hopefully read all of this. There are a number of different aspects here, but really we thought we could give as much flexibility as possible, but also kind of giving some guidelines for landscape requirements. So I think that's
okay.
Probably it. If we wanted to go over specific areas, we definitely can do that.
Okay, thanks for the recap of that. So with that said, committee members, hang tight. General public, if anybody wants to speak in support of this proposal, please raise your hand. General public, anybody that wants to speak in support of this, please raise your hand. Last and final call for the general public to speak in support. Okay, general public, anybody that wants to speak in opposition of this, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of this, please raise your hand. And last call for the general public to speak in opposition. Okay, seeing none, committee members, now we'll turn it back over to you. If you want to have any commentary, ask the proponent any questions, please raise your hand. First hand up I saw was Jeff. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've got several comments. I'll just kind of run through them here. I guess I'm trying to understand the minimum landscape area. Does that mean that is how much will be dedicated on a site to landscaped area, or am I reading that wrong?
Yes, that's the intent.
Okay, all right. The next one is the tree caliper. I think that's wrong. It should be measured at 4.5 feet, not 4 inches. So I think that needs to be amended. And the minimum sizes of plants, I have a real problem with that, because I saw this when I helped write the codes at Aurora. It really causes a lot of problems when you start dictating the gallon sizes of what plantings will or will not be. And it actually is very difficult for the landscape industry to provide all of these at the sizes, especially some of these larger sizes for ground covers and vines in a gallon size. You aren't going to find some of those for all of those. I would recommend we get rid of those. I think the intent is to have a larger size and have survivability. I think there's other ways of getting to that. But I think it's fairly difficult, and it led to a lot of unintended consequences, and even to where Aurora couldn't participate in some of the better landscape conversion programs that are out there. And I think it caused a lot of problems for the landscape industry. So I think we need to be cognizant of that. Last one is, or last two is trees and shrub equivalencies. I think there's some room to maybe move this to the subcommittee to work on the sizing of these, of how many shrubs, because shrubs are not all created equal, and we need to define what is a small, medium, and large shrub. It's not just by the gallons that comes in, it's how large does it get. Overall, I think we're trying to get the how much landscape area is taken up, how much is actually landscaped, not just how many gallons or how big a plant did you buy up front. Last one is the 20 species requirement. I'm trying to remember where that was at in here. That there be at least minimum of 20 species. I think that's a really good aspirational, but I think in some small sites, it's going to be really difficult to get that. And it's going to have, the landscape industry is going to struggle with maintenance on these sites when you start increasing species counts, and it could become a pretty difficult thing for some landscape architects in those areas. It's great for biodiversity. I think it's just, we need to be cognizant of, when you get just a narrow tree lawn area, what does that do? And is 20 the right amount? Thank you.
Do you think, Jeff, that you on multifamily or commercial projects where the minimum is 20?
Sorry, what's that?
For the 20 species for multifamily or commercial, you think that could be an issue for those types of projects?
I think it's not about is it multifamily or commercial? It's how much landscape area do they have? Where is that landscape area? I think of along along Federal Boulevard. I worked with a group that was doing landscaping there. A lot of salt, a lot of traffic, a lot of issues. They had a fairly minimal plant palette that could actually survive that site. Also downtown, you look at some sites that have pretty tight corridors, a lot of shade. Trying to get 20 different species next to a tall building, that's going to be more difficult. And especially when you're talking about 3 feet wide by 20 feet long, I think is that appropriate or not? I think that's my question. And when knowing that really 3 or 4 species to 5 are going to be ones that can survive there. So I think it's more
Understood.
aspirational than
Thank you for
reality.
clarifying.
But I
Great,
like,
next
I
up,
like
we
the
have
different
Jonathan.
aspect.
Is it my turn? Is that what I heard? I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess some of what I'm thinking was essentially covered in that as well, that on large projects where the amount of non-building area is extremely small, coming up with 15% or 10% of the area might leave you with a 5x5 patch. You know, that it's, it feels like there needs to be something that sort of cuts this off when the whole thing becomes not viable. Because a lot of, you know, especially like zero lot line buildings or buildings with very small setbacks, in larger projects in particular, I guess I just don't understand how this would really work. But otherwise, I think
Okay,
it's great.
sure. Next up would be Travis. Travis, your hand went down, so I'll move to the next one.
Oh,
Daniel?
Sorry, I clicked raise lower hand instead of.
Travis, did you have something to add?
Yeah, sorry, I clicked lower hand instead of unmute. Yeah, I liked what Jeff had to say there. I think those are all really good points. I was curious a little bit about some of the minimum landscaping area percentages in 501 3.3.4.1. So it's saying, like, you know, 1 or 2 family homes, that's of 25% of the site area would be landscaped per this. And I'm just curious about how we're looking at our requirements from Denver zoning already and what that overlap is. Typically in those project sites, your building footprint, your mod coverage is 50%. So I wasn't sure what net area actually is there. Is because then we have to take the area within zoning says 50% of the gross area of the site. And then half of the area within setbacks has to be livable plantings. So I'm just seeing a lot of confusion here for me of like, how is this going to be determined and regulated, and how people are going to navigate this? Because I think we're working with 2 different percentages, especially since I'm not sure if net area is area within setbacks. If that's what we're defining it as, then it would match. So I don't know if that needs to be clarified in the code. I think the species count applies across the board. It's really difficult to do 10. And I also had comments on the gallons because I was looking back on some past perennial planning plans from landscape architects, and there's a mix between 1 gallon and 5 gallon that just has to do with the plant species. And I assume we're trying to, you know, minimize watering for survivability of plants, but I'm just not sure if the gallon restriction. But I'm just repeating Jeff, so I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, your hand was up next.
My main concern with this proposal is not about its content. It's about whether it's coordinated with the Denver Green Code. And the Denver Green Code has a number of sections, 2 of them at the beginning of chapter 5, 1 in chapter 6, that address the same thing, it would seem. Where 20% of less, this is in 51332. A minimum area of 10% of the building or additions gross floor area shall be developed or retained as at-grade green space as defined by Denver Green Building Ordinance. And the assumption is that that 10% that is developed per the Denver Green Building Ordinance standards is a green space that meets kind of a standard of vegetation that we like to see in Denver, that kind of maybe, you know, should be somewhat coordinated with this design criteria. But a similar, definitely a similar goal, a different percentage. And there's also 501.333, which is a minimum vegetated area of 20% of the site to be developed and retained as vegetated area. And there is some detail on what that vegetated area should look like, and even more of a driver of what that looks like, that minimum vegetated area of 20% of the site is in chapter 6 with the water use, where it asks that, or you get a credit if a minimum of 60% of the area of the landscape is biodiverse, etc., low water, plant select, drought tolerant, etc. You know, there's these criteria. So there are multiple sections here that this amendment might do a much better job at addressing the same thing, but I wouldn't want it not to be cognizant of what those sections are and not coordinated with them, and this not to be a bigger picture conversation, because adding another similar requirement, even though these are obviously likely all electives, and people can do it one way and some projects can do it a little bit differently, but that could lead to a lot of confusion. I would think I would rather see one really good section in the code. Obviously what we have in the DGC currently is based on the ICC's green code, and that's why it looks the way it looks. We've amended it a bit, but this might be a much better, this proposal might be a much better code to have, you know, not informed by the ICC's version, and that might make it just so much better and so much more relevant to Denver and so much more comprehensive, but it does need to acknowledge what we have in the code and work with it, or include in the proposal to strike sections of the code. You know, this proposal is kind of doing what other sections of our current green code do without really addressing those sections at all.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Next up is Austin.
Yeah, I just wanted to say there probably needs to be kind of a site minimum square footage for any of these percentages to apply, because when we get into some of these zero lot line buildings and utility easements, things like that, you might not even have the 10% that's required, just because there's an easement in the way, and Xcel Energy is not going to allow you to put a tree or anything under it. So just making sure that, I don't know what it would be if it's a quarter acre is kind of your minimum size, or if it's even smaller, to make sure that we're getting residential. And then down in 501 3.3.4.4, I think a little bit lower in part B, we start to talk about clustering and yeah, what was I seeing down there? Something to avoid overwatering. There was another portion I believe I read on zoning of these, and I just think it should be amended to say hydrozoning, which will be a defined term later on. So this would be consistent with other proposals and things that are already in the code.
Okay, thank you. Kristy?
E in that section, just FYI. Plant spacing and clustering. Thank you.
So I had a few clarifications that I wanted to float out there through this, and one of them actually, I wanted to maybe ask Kristen if we had suggested to move some of the existing Denver Green Code provisions into mandatory code, so that's kind of in the baseline. And I personally need to go back and look at that, but Daniel, in response to what you're saying, the intent was to take the sort of, I believe, and Kristen, correct me if I'm mistaken, those were all provisions that had a lower threshold than this one that we were adding, and we were proposing that those could be moved to mandatory regulations, and then this would move into the Denver Green Code. But Kristen, am I misspeaking?
I think that was the intent, yes.
Okay. And then as far as projects that have lot line to lot line coverage and very little green space, I would say that, similar to what we talked about for other provisions before this, if it just doesn't make sense for a project to pursue this, then they don't need to. But if we start setting thresholds, then we're excluding projects. And so it's kind of a self-selection process, because those project teams could also say, actually, we really want this to be a priority, and we're going to think about this in the concept of what we are designing, and make that accommodation by using a different design approach. So my personal recommendation would be that we not exclude projects because we know that it would be difficult for them to pursue this, we leave it open to projects and allow the self-selection to happen. And before this ever gets moved to mandatory, there'll be new, fresh discussion about what is reasonable to make mandatory. And we could actually learn from who selects it and who doesn't. And that would inform what actually gets recommended and potentially move to mandatory in the future. And so I think, just looking at my list, so the species number requirements could be adjusted to include some defined exceptions if we wanted to. So rather than decreasing the number of species of plants on a site for all projects, we could consider having a little subcommittee talk about what would these specific exceptions be. So like if a site is excessively shaded or limited and it doesn't make sense for them to have as many species of plants, we could have that be one of the exceptions, as opposed to just decreasing the number of species for all sites, which would then lose the opportunity of capturing the sites that have the opportunity to raise the bar and have more species of plants. That was everything that.
Okay, next up is Jason.
To go along with what Kristy just said and what we talked about earlier, I just don't see the need of the language to say mandatory in these, and that kind of applies to all of these amendments. So I don't see why we can't just have the mandatory language removed. That's all I have on that.
Thank you. Next up, Travis.
Yeah, I was gonna kind of make a similar comment to that on the mandatory side, because it just would read as a little confusing, and I wasn't sure. I realized I didn't cover it last time, but there was in that first section here that covers it. It says major renovations, and I just don't want people to think like, oh, if I change my property, then I have to rip out and change all the landscaping, because I think that would lead to more scrapes versus adaptive reuse, which I think would be a carbon negative. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong there. So maybe it is just about removing the mandatory or creating different terms in the future for renovations of ways to meet it, but that's my only thought.
All right, Daniel, you're up next.
Sorry. So in the scoping statement 501334, it includes major renovation, which again, we would need to define, but we could definitely include, I have a feeling that we're going to need a definition from the threshold of a major renovation in general in this code, which we do not have yet. But in 5013341, major renovation is not in the A, B, or C options, and it's not clear to me what the intent is in terms of what to provide, because everything subsequent to 5013341 is in service of that section. So if there's nothing in 3341 for a major renovation, then really a major renovation is left out.
Okay, thank you. Anybody have anything new to add on commentary? Okay, seeing none, I will ask for someone to make a motion. Daniel, your hand's still up. I don't know if that was intended or not. Okay, is there a motion? Anybody want to make a motion? Nobody wants to make a motion. I know it's getting close to 5.
Well,
come on.
I'll make a motion to keep the amendment as is.
Okay, there's a motion. Is there a second? Jason, I see your hand up. Do you have something?
I was just going to say make a motion to remove mandatory.
Okay, Adam, since you were the first one to make a motion, are you okay with making that motion to modify your motion to remove the word mandatory?
No.
Okay. All right. So sorry, Jason, that won't be this time. Jeff, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I'd like to also add that if we do pass this through committee, that it should also go to the subcommittee to actually coordinate with other green code items and ensure that like definitions and language are coordinated.
Adam, are you okay with that?
Yes.
Your original motion? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So we still need a second. Is there a second? Adam, sorry, Austin.
Yeah, I'll second motion to pass with further referral to other code sections.
Okay, great. So we have a motion and a second. The motion that you're going to be voting on is to pass this proposal with the intent to coordinate with other green code definitions. That is the motion on the table and the second. So all those in favor, please raise your hand. Oh, sorry. Let me back up. We did have a break. I want to make sure we still have the right number of people on here. All voting members, please raise your hand to be accounted for at this time. You're not voting on anything. I just want to make sure we got the right count. Okay, we have 22 voting, or sorry, we have 17 voting members. Okay, cool. Go ahead and lower your hands. Okay, all hands are lowered. Now, we'll call the vote for that motion. Go ahead, if you're in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, the votes are still coming in. Votes are still coming in. Okay, I'm counting. We have 14. Go ahead and lower your hand. Okay, all those opposed, please raise your hand. Okay, I see 2. Go lower your hand. And all the lower your hands. All those abstaining, please raise your hand. Okay, 1. Okay, lower your hands. This motion passes, this proposal passes with the intent to coordinate definitions with the other green codes. All right, next item of business. That was number 28. We're going to item number 32. Kristen, why don't you go ahead and take it while I open it up.
Awesome. Sorry, I'm still having really terrible audio quality, so I hope you can hear me. The next one is tree preservation in primary and side street setbacks. Right now, this is currently in the zoning code, but only limited to where new structures are being proposed. And so this extends the tree preservation for alterations and additions, as well as change in occupancy and repairs to retain more established trees in Denver. It does not include anything that is diseased or damaged. And it does have, I think, the correct definition of an established tree. So thank you, Jeff, for pointing that out in the last discussion. So I think that is really the gist of this. It's pretty short and sweet. Would love to hear some feedback.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. We will go to the general public first. Anybody that wants to speak in support, please raise your hand. General public, anybody that wants to speak in support of this, please raise your hand. And third and final call, general public, anybody that wants to speak in support, please raise your hand. Seeing none, general public, anybody that wants to speak in opposition of this, please raise your hand. Anybody that wants to speak in opposition from the general public, please raise your hand. And third and final call, anybody who wants to speak in opposition of this from the general public, please raise your hand. Seeing none, I will turn it back over to the committee. Committee, I do want to remind you that if you have the same thoughts as another committee member, that you please just say that you sentiment so-and-so on the same thoughts, so we don't repeat ourselves and save us some time. So first hand I see up is Eric. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Actually, just a quick point of order. I realized at the conclusion of the last proposal, we may not have identified those committee members that wanted to be part of the subcommittee. I wonder if we should do that briefly before moving on.
Yeah, thank you. As I was making my notes, I put that in my notes and I was like, oh no, we didn't. So let's, Jeff, if you want to go ahead and lower your hand, or if you want, anybody that wants to be part of that committee of that last proposal, please raise your hand so our note taker can make note of that. So we do have Jeff, Austin, anybody else? Okay, thank you. You can lower your hands on that. Thanks, Eric, for pointing that out. So moving back to committee discussion on the current proposal, proposal number 32. Jeff, go ahead.
I just want to open up some discussion about the tree trunk diameter of 6 inches or more. Is that, I think we could go lower than that and still and actually bring more trees into that preservation. I know that certainly is more work for others, but I think the idea is to have, you know, more established trees, and there's a lot of trees that don't make it to the 6-inch size. So,
and this definition was from the municipal code for chapter 57 for vegetation, just FYI.
yeah, and I think for green codes, we could be stretching to something lower than that. I would suggest 4 inches or 5 inches. I don't know. I'd like to hear from others that work in this area more.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Travis, go ahead.
I had a question I guess I have a couple questions. If we're talking about preserving a tree, are we determining that as its trunk location within the setback? Or are we talking about the canopy? Thinking about being able to do adaptive reuse, you know, if a tree's trunk is in the setback, on a side setback that's only 5 feet, there's a good chance that it's interrupting anything going on in the building. So I think we could use some clarification there. That would probably.
Do you have a recommendation, Travis? I mean, I'm assuming that it's the easiest way to figure this out is where the trunk is placed, but if you have other opinions, please let us know.
I think it should be the canopy, like the tree shadow or whatever they call it, the drip shadow, or that's usually how they define trees against how far you can go to power poles and stuff like that. So
right, the drip line. Okay.
And then I don't know if we should talk about a replacement provision in the code. We'll let other people talk about that. I was more curious about how we're locating the trees.
Okay, great. Next up is Christopher.
Hi there. Wanted to address, you know, from a property management standpoint, if there could be any exception written into this as to if the tree is impinging on the repair of, you know, plumbing lines or something below it. Is there an exception that can be made for those kind of repairs? And also, I would also, to second what was just said, I'd like some more clarification on what exactly constitutes relocation. Is that, are you able to relocate tree to another spot? Is that, you know, within certain feet of where it was existing, or those kind of things?
Okay, great things to keep in mind when someone makes a motion. Next up is Eric.
I think I'm asking this question based on a project I was involved with in Lodi, where if we have 6 trees along 16th Street that are good sized trees, yet it prevents me from building the project, I would expect I can take the trees down so I can actually build the project. So I don't understand, is this preventing me from taking the trees down, which prevents me from building the project?
Sure. Kristen, do you want to elaborate on that?
I'll let the city maybe take that, but I think, yes, that would be the case, is that you wouldn't be able to build the project.
Okay, then I think I already know my vote. Thank you.
So I would add a little clarification on that, though. A couple of things on that, like sometimes logistical plans can be modified to preserve more trees rather than fewer trees. And then there's also, again, going back to the fact that this provision doesn't have to apply to every scenario. So just please keep that in mind, that not all provisions apply to all projects.
That keeps it ambiguous on whether or not I'm going to build a project or not. That sounds crazy. Where I am going to take these trees down because of a safety issue that I'm going to have just to access a bloody site. So I don't really understand why this is in this code.
So I guess what I'm getting at is that sometimes teams come up with one logistical plan that wipes out all of the trees on the site. And if they work with their contractor, they can come up with a different logistical plan that doesn't. And this would encourage teams to think about that alternative approach as opposed to just assuming. The default in the development community currently that we see is we'll wipe out all the trees and then we'll plant at the end because that is the simplest approach. But like I've gone out to LA and seen projects that were built around massive trees because those trees are considered precious because they are so scarce. And so sometimes we can come back and think of a different logistical plan that preserves the trees. This is meant to encourage that creative thinking on how to approach it. If a team doesn't want to do that, they don't have to choose this provision. That's what the Denver Green Code is here to do. It's to give options and to encourage things that would improve our community as a whole. So if a project team doesn't want to prioritize that and doesn't want to think about the logistics differently, they don't have to because they can choose a different provision. This is not mandatory. This is not a code that is ever going to be totally mandatory. This is an introduction of a provision so that we can start to encourage more beneficial practices in the community and gain feedback about why teams do or do not choose the things that are being suggested.
Yeah.
All right, next up is Daniel.
I'm not recalling now who brought it up, but there was a question of trunk versus canopy. And in order to understand how to modify to address that, I need to understand better what that was. And maybe it also speaks to trees that are in conflict with construction. Is the question whether a tree with a canopy that goes beyond the setback and actually into a constructible zone, that should be allowed or allowed to be removed, or I didn't follow that. I know there was something there that informs the question of how to keep the trees that don't conflict with construction, where maybe removing the ones that do by changing from trunk to canopy. And I wanted to understand that better.
Sure. I think that was Travis that stated that. Travis, if you want to chime in.
Yeah. So I have a lot of different projects, but I was thinking particularly of I'm working with some clients that are doing a pop top with the idea that they make their home livable and better in all fronts and prevent like relocating into a place like Stapleton or, they're building up near Rocky Mountain Arsenal and all that. So that's actually not very sustainable at all to relocate, but they have a tree right next to it. So a tree would impinge on this, and it's the trunk location is on the property line. It's within the 5-foot setback. But they're going to have to either cut the whole tree down or do some massive modifications to it. And I was just thinking in my head that it would be nice if clients like that are actually doing something sustainable, which is adaptive reuse and making a better house on all fronts, be able to meet these type of requirements. I also had another thought in here too, and I skipped over it because I read it. I had a note on defensible space, and I was thinking of a completely different overlay, but that's more of not having plantings within 5 feet of a house in general anyway for fire reduction. There's still areas of Denver that are in the urban wildlife and fire zone, and are, especially vulnerable to grassland fires. So it would be nice if there was some flexibility to still meet this requirement while understanding that we're trying to protect massive destruction from wildfires.
So would it be correct then that instead of defining an established tree, based on where the canopy is, because obviously the canopy of the tree you're talking about is within the setback. It's both within the setback and beyond the setback. I think what you're asking for would be like an exception for a tree that the canopy extends onto the buildable portion of the property.
Yeah, I think that, and I think there should be an exception if a project's meeting the urban wildfire code. That it's like it's a chapter in the IBC.
Thank you.
Okay, Dana, thanks Daniel, and thanks Travis for that follow-up. Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think my comment might be around like overall process here. These last couple measures feel pretty in the weeds, no pun intended. Should we encourage the preservation of mature trees? Absolutely. Similarly with some of the other ones. I think the reason what I'm struggling with is making sure that we're really clear about those items which are part of the pilot kind of portion of the what's it called, the green code, whatever we're working on here, and versus like the additional measures, of which there's a menu and you select a few. I think not knowing the full range of things that someone might be asked to select.
Yeah, what's going on, man?
Hello, can you guys mute Eric? Sorry, so not sort of having a full sense of the of what all the menu items might be. It's sort of hard to know how it's going to work when it sort of comes down to it. So let's say that a site doesn't really have trees that's a priority and that's not applicable to them, then they move on, and presumably there's others that they would need to kind of select or anyway. So I think at the end of the day, I don't want to get hung up on this. I'm sure I'm going to vote to say like, yes, this should be on the list of things that people should get credit for if they could do it. But I think between now and maybe next time, it would help to essentially illustrate out the context and provide the essentially full range of what all might be included in that. That's just something I'm struggling with. It's obviously not specific to this comment, but it's a comment that I've had for the last couple of these. I don't know if others have the same thoughts. If not, we can keep going.
Thanks, Josh. That's good feedback. We can get with the city and see if maybe they can put a visual together for the team, since that seems to be an underlying concern on all of these. So we will ask that the city maybe do that at a later time so we can move forward and get through this one. Next up, Travis, your hand's up.
Sorry, I had it up before I was answering Daniel's question. So I don't have a question, sorry.
Okay, so seeing no more hands up, is there I would call for someone to do a motion here. Daniel, I see your hand up first.
I would present a motion to approve with a modification, and the modification would be an exception for a tree where the caliper is, where a certain percentage of the caliper, maybe someone more knowledgeable here can help us define what that percentage is, but more than 30% of the caliper is on the buildable area of the lot.
Canopy, not caliber.
I'm sorry. Thank you. It's late in the day. Canopy. Thanks.
Okay. Next up, Travis.
Would you be open to adding an exception for if a project is meeting the wildland urban interface code? That would still allow us to save trees in the primary setback. It just probably eliminates side setbacks.
Yes, I would.
Okay, so what was that, Travis? Can you reiterate that?
It'd be an exception for projects that they're meeting in the side setback, if it's meeting the wildland urban interface code.
The way I would present that would be the exception is preserving trees in the side setback only where meeting the wildland urban.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think
next up.
Yeah.
Okay, next up is Adam. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just hoping, Travis, you can explain to me. I'm not overly familiar with the urban interface code. So how does that translate into less trees or more trees, I guess, just to totally simplify it?
I think, so the basic deal is we have defensible space around a house for combustible materials in that code set. So if you're in a residential zone, you might have a 5-foot side setback, but that defensible space is 5 feet in the code. So you would want to cut that tree down. Now our front setback is going to be completely different, and we can still afford plantings and have that and maintain trees. But I wouldn't want you not to be able to meet a green code thing if you're doing something that's also about preserving structures in this and creating more resilient communities. Because a wildfire that tears through everything, you know, that wild interface code, it prevents a lot of contamination. I mean, the Marshall Fire, there's an insane amount of pollutants that tore through everything. It's a big EPA disaster right now, you know, to clear all that out time frame, and then rebuilding is a huge amount of material and cost, carbon cost, right?
Right, but we're talking about new construction, right? So the trees were essentially there before the house was, or the building.
My assumption is that this is for addition, it has additions and alterations and repairs.
Oh, you're right. It's got all of them.
That's correct, yeah.
You are correct. Thanks.
As the one setting forth the motion, I just want to clarify that it's with the intent to modify to include these exceptions, but for them to be rewritten by staff just to be correct code language. But what's written here is not going to be the actual language, but is going to be the intent.
Sure, thank you for the clarification. Eric, you're up next.
Thank you. Just as a reference, I believe that only about 1% of properties in Denver are in areas that would be not governed by, but affected by those fire zones that would apply the urban wildland interface. It is, I would also point out, it is not currently a code that the city and county adopts. That's not a problem. We can use it by reference in the green code, but just as a point of reference for the very small percentage that it would or could have an impact on.
Yeah, definitely. It's more of a Boulder County thing right now. With recent events, I just see it as more of an eventuality and would like to plan ahead.
Sure. Okay, next up is Antonio. Antonio, you're muted.
I would table on what Eric's saying. It's not a book that we would enforce. And secondly, I mean, even if we look at 302.1, table 302.1, really not going after the enforcement of trees, if you will, not something that we typically see in Denver. Additionally, I would propose as written, and that we go from the trunk line. It's going to make it easier in the field. That's just my thoughts on that.
Okay, so there is a motion on the table to modify this with these two exceptions on the screen. Is there a second for that? Kristy?
I would second that.
Okay, great. So there is a motion and a second to approve this with the modifications. So we got to vote on the modifications first. So that's what we'll do. The modifications are these two exceptions written on the screen. However, though the intent of those are going to be written to be hashed out with a subcommittee of the group to be written properly, but the intent is what's written on the screen. So before we vote, I see some people have dropped off. I do need to get an accurate count. So if you're a voting member, please raise your hand.
And Kevin, can you clarify the exception about the 30% of canopy? I don't know if we finished that.
Sure. Daniel, you want to finish that for us? So I see 15 voting members in the meantime.
Yes, so this, in order to get a credit for this section, one needs to preserve any and all trees that the tree, meaning the trunk of the tree, is in the side setback. But there's an exception that if the majority of the or more than 30% of the canopy, which would be the majority, well, no, not quite the majority. More than 30% of the canopy is over the property, and it would interfere with construction. Then, even though the trunk is in the setback, because that trunk is pretty close to the property and the canopy therefore is significantly on the property, you would be able to remove that tree and still get a credit. And the second exception is that you could comply if you're using the wildland urban interface and it was applicable to the project, you could comply with only the front setback and ignore the side setback and still get a credit.
Okay, Daniel, so can you confirm that this is your intent, is what's written on the screen then? And then we will have 2 more people to talk.
Yeah.
Okay, Adam, go ahead. We already have a motion, so if there's anything new to add, I ask that you just stick to that.
Yeah, just one thing new to add is that I don't think you need to cut down the entire tree. If there's a canopy issue, you can trim the tree, you can cut off some of the tree, you don't need to take the whole tree down. So I just wanted to mention that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, go ahead. Oh, it looks like you lowered your hand.
Can I?
Oh, Jonathan, you're muted.
Yep, sorry. You'd think I'd have a handle of this after 2 years. That was essentially my point, but I guess I wanted to propose to Daniel that, I don't know whether the 30% is sort of scientifically based or not. I'm not an arborist. But yeah, that we propose that whatever the percentage is, that if the tree can be left there, but whatever is pruned off and the tree still survives, that is the kind of language that we use.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, I imagine each tree might be different, but I would like the committee to come up with the percentage. So let's do X%, and experts will come up with an appropriate percent that cannot typically be just trimmed.
Okay, very good. I have 15 voting members still in attendance. So you're voting on the amendments here of these 2 exceptions with the intent of a subcommittee to finalize the percentage there. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, I have 13. Go ahead and lower your hands. And all those opposed, please raise your hand. Okay, I have 3. I must have miscounted on that, so that's 16. I'll go ahead and lower your hands, just in case I miscounted. All those abstaining? None. Okay, so the modification is passed. So now what we need to do is vote on the proposal. So we would need someone to make a motion on that.
So you need a motion now to pass the proposal as is without the modifications?
So, right, so we voted that the modifications would be finalized via subcommittee. So now that those modifications have been approved, now we want to pass that this whole proposal passes based on those modifications by that subcommittee. So we were just voting to make sure that you're all okay with the subcommittee making the final tweaks to this. You're all okay with that. Now that you're okay with that, we want to make sure that you want to pass this whole proposal as written. Courtney, go ahead.
I make a motion to pass this proposal as written, with the understanding that the subcommittee will come back with the percentages.
Great, Eric. Great. Okay. With that being said, I'll call a vote. We have 16 voting members. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, 13, go ahead and lower your hands. And Renee, I'm going to lower your hand. All right. All those opposed, please raise your hand. Three. Okay. So this does pass 13-3. So now we just need to ask all those that would like to be part of that subcommittee to finalize that percentage. Go ahead and raise your hand. And Kara, the note taker, I see Eric E. Oh, sorry, he took his hand down. I see Adam and Daniel would like to be part of that subcommittee. Okay, with that being said, we are done for the day. We are a little bit over time. I want to thank you all again for your time and the great discussions that we had today. We did get through a few of these, not as many as we wanted, but I think it was great conversation. So thanks again for your commitment to this committee. I will stay on the line. I'll stop the recording, but any feedback, good, bad, or indifferent on how to improve the process, or if you just want to vent, that's fine too. I'll stay on the line. But thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your night.
Did you